Okay. So our talk tonight is on theological reasoning, how we reason in theology. Maybe before we start, just a quick summary of what we've done up to now. So we've seen in the second talk, we saw that theology is a science, but every science needs first principles. Where does theology get its first principles? From God's own science, from God's revelation. And so theology it's a science that borrows its principles from the science of God. In other words, the science that God has of himself. And so theology is a subordinate science, subordinate to God's knowledge, but not subordinate to any other science. And then we saw that it's one science because it has one object. It's a science that's both theoretical and practical. It seeks the truth about God for its own sake, but also to achieve man's final end. So it's a one and the same time theoretical and practical, and it's the most noble science we saw of all the sciences because it has the highest object and because it has the highest end. And for all these reasons, it's not just a science, but also wisdom. That one science that seeks the deepest and highest things for its own sake. And as wisdom, it enables us to judge every other thing. The wise man is the one who can judge everything. Right? So that's kind of where we've the development, how we've seen theology is. And now let's look at how does it operate? What does it do? Does it use argumentation? Right? So St. Thomas Aquinas, when he's developing what is theology, he poses this question: does theology, is it argumentative? Does it use argumentation? Not obviously that we get in fights, but and somebody might say, well, no, because it's relying on authority. We said before that theology is a science because it takes its principles from God. And so it would seem that there's not any room for any kind of disputation like we would have in philosophy or the other sciences. But that's not true. It wouldn't be a science if it didn't use arguments, because every science builds on foundations by means of argumentation. And theology has to also. And this is true of the great, the medieval doctors. What they would do is, people like St. Thomas Aquinas or St. Bonaventure, they would do disputed questions. They would have a question. So the entire theological education in a medieval university is disputed questions. So you start with a question, and then you got two sides, and each one argues as well as it can for its own position, and then the master gives his thesis and responds to all the counter objections. The whole thing is an argumentation. And this is not new with Christianity. Judaism as well understood theology as argumentative. The rabbis very much disagreeing with one another. And that's precisely how the thing advances. Now, if you all agreed, there wouldn't be any progress, because the whole growth in knowledge comes from seeing a problem, a difficulty, a knot, in which there are different views, and untying that knot. And so the rabbis were famous for this, but the Christian doctors no less. I remember going to a yeshiva several years ago. I had a good friend who became an Orthodox rabbi, and he took me to the yeshiva where they study, but it was a very different kind of studying than we're used to, going to a library where it's very quiet and everyone's intent on their own work. It was nothing like that. Everyone was paired up. So in the yeshiva, you have to have a partner, a chaver, a friend, who is your discussion partner. And you argue opposite sides of every issue. And so it was rather deafening going into the yeshiva, because you had, 15 different pairs, each one arguing at the top of their voice. And I imagine it would have been something similar to that when St. Paul was studying theology with Gamaliel. And it was like that in the medieval university as well. In fact, what they would do on holidays in the medieval university for Christmas and Easter is they would have the masters be asked anything. So St. Thomas would be brought before the university, and anyone could get up and ask him anything. And he would have to argue, and on the spur of the moment on any topic. And that was fun. That's the medieval entertainment. Okay, so yes, theology is argumentative, and in fact, the history of the church is full of excessive argumentation. Now, the different theological schools not only revel in theological argumentation, but sometimes carry it too far into what's called odium theologicum, theological hatred, which is when you take your party line a little too seriously. But nevertheless, the argumentation is an essential part of theology. So how do we do it? All right, that's what we're going to look at tonight. And there are two ways that you can resolve any argument. The easiest way is by appealing to authority. The more arduous way is by reasoning through to a conclusion based on shared premises. Right? Now, obviously, the second is better when you can do it. But we use both kinds all the time. So, for example, an argument of authority would be say, well, this position is right because Einstein said so. Now, in the human sciences, that can never be the last word, because how do we know that he was right? But since in a theology it's different, because if you say, well, this position is right because God said so, well, that settles the question, right? In other words, in theology admits of an argument of authority in a way that no other science does. Because in every other science, the human authority, even if they're Einstein or Aristotle, they could be mistaken. But God can't be deceived or deceive. So an argument of authority in theology has absolutely decisive weight. If the authority is God, or if the authority is someone who speaks on his behalf infallibly. And that would be the church. When the church uses, when the Holy Father, or the Father and the bishops, and the Holy Father and the bishops use their full authority. Now, there are four kinds of questions that one can ask. One can ask, does something exist? Now, when we looked at that at the beginning, is there such a thing as theology in our first talk? And we'll come back to it when we look at the existence of God. So, does something exist? Another question is, what is it? A third question, is something true of it? Whether something is X or Y, and then why? Now, of these questions, we can answer two of them by way of authority. We can say, yes, something exists because God said so. And we can answer the third one, is something true of something else? Yes, God said so. And in theology, we do this a lot. For example, is the Eucharist a sacrament? Yes, the Church has defined it. Are there 7 sacraments? Yes, the Church has defined that. Right? So some questions we can answer by an authority, but some questions you can't. And above all, the question, why? Why is this true of that? Well, because Einstein said so, or even because God said so, doesn't answer that question. Right? So there are some questions in theology that can't be answered simply by authority, but that require looking for the cause. Right? So which kind of arguments does theology use? Arguments of authority or arguments of reason? All right, the answer obviously is both. This is one of those both and things, which is usually the case. But both seem to have problems. So if you didn't have the both answer, if you're trying to say one or the other, both of them have problems. Because if it used only reason, well, then it would just be philosophy. Theology would be no different than philosophy trying to reason about God. So if theology only used arguments of reason, it wouldn't get very far. But if it only used arguments of authority, yes, it could know the things that God has revealed, and we could know them with certainty, but we wouldn't be able to penetrate into the why of them. We wouldn't be able to understand why God did what he did without reasoning about it. Right? So theology needs both kinds of arguments. An argument of authority to know what he's revealed, and arguments of reason to probe into why he's revealed that, or why he's done that, or why he is that, why he is a Trinity. And we'll come back to this. All right, so both and. So we must use arguments of authority because theology is built on God's revelation, and everything we do is relying on God's authority. Right? Otherwise, we couldn't even start. So theology has to begin with arguments of authority. God said so. And so St. Thomas says, it is especially proper for sacred theology to argue from authority, because the principles of this doctrine are received from revelation. Right? That's where we get the articles of faith. Thus it is necessary to believe on the authority of those to whom the revelation was made. For example, Moses, all the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, etc., and above all, Jesus Christ, and his apostles, and his church, and her magisterium. Nor is this contrary to the dignity of this doctrine. For although the value of an argument from authority based on human reason, say in physics, that's the weakest, an argument of authority based on divine revelation is the strongest. Right? In other words, an argument of authority based on Einstein, that's weaker than doing the experiment yourself. Well, that's why, a physicist doesn't just accept anything that some other famous physicist says, but you check it, and you make your own theories, and you advance it. And certainly an argument of authority based on an Einstein is valuable, but it can't be the last word. Otherwise, science wouldn't advance the way it is. But in theology, it's different, no? Because God does have the last word, period. Right? So we could say that in terms of certainty, an argument of authority in theology is the most decisive. In other words, no other argument that I could give will be so decisive for giving certainty as the church has declared this infallibly, period. But what's the problem? If I only give arguments like that, you know that something's true, but you don't know why it's true. And so you leave dissatisfied because the mind wants to understand why. But anyway, before we go to the why, let's go back to an argument of authority is very important in theology. And it has its own, it has a particular name called positive theology. Positive theology is determining what God has revealed, where he's revealed it, basically those two things, what has been revealed and where and when. Right? So in order to show that something's true in theology, we show God said it through Moses. It's contained in Scripture, or it's contained in tradition. And that tradition includes the fathers of the church's liturgy, and the consensus of the fathers and the great theologians. Right? And so we call that positive theology. And so theology always has to do that. It always has to return to its own sources, the sources of revelation. And that's above all Scripture, but Scripture and tradition together. Right? And they're inexhaustible. Pius XII, in an encyclical Humani Generis on the nature of theology, he says, theologians must always return to the sources of divine revelation. It belongs to them, to theologians, to point out how the doctrine of the living teaching authority, how the doctrine of the church is rooted explicitly or implicitly in the Scriptures or in tradition. Right? So one of the tasks of the theologians is to explain, if the church teaches something, to explain where it has its root or source, where we find that in God's revelation and in the tradition of the church. And theology remains ever fresh because it always goes back to its sources. If we were ever to leave aside those sources, and theology would lose its sap, its life. But when the theologian does this, it always has to do it in communion with the church. And we'll come to this in the next talk. Theology is an ecclesial science. Okay. All right, let's go on to the arguments now, not from authority, but from reason. All right, so theology isn't limited to arguments from authority. And because we said that its goal is, theology is faith-seeking understanding. And so we want to understand what God has revealed and not just say what He's revealed. Right? So in other words, we want to get to see the causes of it.
Larry,
Mm-hmm.
can I ask a question about authority and infallibility? Why would human beings expect that measure of certainty? For instance, I'm forgetting instances like when Abraham was told he'd be a father of many nations, he made a mistake in a way of getting Ishmael.
Okay, let me.
All kinds of instances of mistakes. So, and it seems that trusting God, one is led to the goal.
Okay, good question. So why should we're going to have a whole talk on this later, but it's too much later, and so I can't always use that excuse. It comes down to this: if God Himself speaks to man, and where He clearly speaks and what He's clearly said, that's clearly infallible. No, because God is omniscient. God is God. No human doctrine can claim infallibility because it's based on fallible human reason. But only theology can claim infallibility because it's based on God's infallible word. Now, much of what theology does makes no such claim, and we'll talk about that shortly. But some of what theology does makes that claim. That's precisely the role of positive theology. In other words, positive theology is established what has God said, and where do we find that? And that gives us a certainty. And why should we aspire to? I don't think man could aspire to that, but it's the other way around. It's God who has given us that. In other words, man could. In our first talk, we spoke about how sacred theology is different from, say, the natural religions of the world, or philosophy. Philosophy is ascending to God, and so are the natural religions of the world. Whereas the Catholic, God's revelation to Israel and culminating in the church is the opposite movement, coming down from God. And so this has a certainty that man's ascent can't have. Right? And if God gives this certainty, when he reveals something, it's reasonable to think that he's going to preserve with the same certainty what he's first revealed. And so God's infallibility is a share in it, a participation of it, is given to the church. So that each human being can have the same certainty that, say, Abraham had when God spoke to him. Now, it's true, one can make mistakes. And Abraham is a good example. So Abraham was not mistaken at all that God said to him that he would have offspring as many as the sands of the sea and the stars of the sky. Right? He knew that God said that to him, and that remains true. Where does he err? In his own means of bringing it about. Through Hagar rather than through Sarah in the proper time. Right? And so the same thing can happen to the theologian. He can start with true premises and then go wrong from them. But God's word remains infallible. But keep it for afterwards, right? Okay. Now, that certainty that we have where God has spoken isn't had where we begin to reason, right? There's no doubt about that. So in theological reasoning, we gain something and we lose something, right? We gain a deeper insight into the causes, into the why question, but we also introduce possibility of erring in using our reasoning, no doubt. But it's worth it. And so in reasoning about theological questions, using human reason on the basis of what God has revealed, right, we learn how to think through something. And only in this way can theology really be a science. No, because we said theology is a science because it's built on articles of faith. But every science has to build. No, it has to have foundations, and that which is built on those foundations. Right? So theology, yes, it has certain foundations, infallible foundations, and it builds on those foundations. And what it builds might not always be infallible, but nevertheless, that building is what makes it a science. Right? There's a great quote of St. Thomas Aquinas where he speaks about the goal of a teacher of theology. So, and this is in one of those, it's Quodlibet is the name of those sessions that they had where they could ask anything of the master. Quodlibet means whatever. And so it was disputed questions about whatever. And so one of these disputed questions, St. Thomas was asked about theological method. And so he says this: disputed questions can be ordered to two ends. One kind of disputation is ordered to removing doubt about whether something is true. That's what we just spoke about, positive theology, an argument of authority. And in a theological disputation of this kind, one must principally rely on authorities that are received by those with whom one is disputing. Another kind of disputed question is that of the masters in the schools, like St. Thomas Aquinas, who seek not simply to remove error, but to instruct their listeners and lead them to understand the truth under consideration. You notice the word understand. Under. To get under what you're standing on. Right? To understand is to see what is the cause or foundation on which you stand. For this it is necessary that the argument be based on arguments that uncover the root of the truth and make one see how and why the thesis is true. Not just whether it's true, but how and why. Otherwise, if the master decides the question simply by citing authorities, even if the authorities are Moses and Jesus Christ, the listener may satisfy himself that the thesis is true, but he'll acquire no science or understanding and will walk away with an empty mind. Not entirely empty, but empty with regard to the why. Right? In other words, it's not enough to simply know the bottom line, because that won't help you in solving other questions. It won't give wisdom, right? It won't give an ordered whole. Right? So we need to do both things. Arguments of authority, but more importantly, to go into the why of things. And that means to wonder why God has revealed what he's revealed, or why he's done what he's done. And it's interesting, in the Summa of St. Thomas, the Summa Theologica, most of it is that question. Why has God done what he's done? And we'll come back to this in a few minutes. But there's an objection. If we use arguments of reason, somebody might object, well, it seems like the merit of faith will be taken away. If it's, in other words, faith has merit because we believe what we don't see. And if we use arguments of reason, it seems we might be in danger of seeing. But actually, the reality is we'll never see these things like that. At least not the mysteries. In other words, we have to make a distinction here between the natural truths about God that reason can get to and the mysteries that reason can't get to on its own. And so here we need two different approaches in dealing with those two different kinds of truths. And so with regard to the natural truths that we talked about in that first talk, things like God exists, and then all his attributes, that he's one. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. And then we could go on to he's omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, free, creator. And then we could also do truths about man, that man has a spiritual soul, that man is free, that there's a moral law, natural law, that there's judgment. Those are natural truths that reason can investigate. But there are also others, the mysteries, that transcend reason, such as God is Trinity. What else? Incarnation. The redemption. Grace. And the church and the sacraments. Right? And chief among them, the Eucharist. So we have to make a distinction of method when theology is considering these truths here, or the mysteries. So let's look first at the natural truths. About God. So what should the theologian do in order to give that insight and understanding? Well, the theologian, since reason can demonstrate reason should demonstrate. In other words, if we can prove, even though God has revealed these, God has revealed that he exists, that he's one, but reason can also arrive at it, and therefore, in order to give the faithful some penetration into these truths, the theologian ought to demonstrate them. And how should he demonstrate? Well, borrowing from the philosopher. So what St. Thomas does, for example, with the first question of all, does God exist, is he takes from the philosophers the best arguments for the existence of God. And that's St. Thomas's 5 ways to prove God's existence. And later on, we'll go through them. Right? So the theologian borrows here from the philosopher. In other words, the theologian makes use of what reason can do. Now, somebody might object, well, many of the faithful won't be able to follow that. That may be so. But I guess one can respond in 2 different ways. It's useful for those of the faithful that can follow it. That would be one response. And another response, I think, is that everyone can follow them to a certain point. In other words, it's one thing to follow a philosophical argument rigorously. It's another thing to get a sense of it, a grasp of it intuitively. No, and that's, I think, part of our job in catechesis, is to give at least an intuitive sense of these truths and why they are so for all the faithful, so that the faithful, when they speak about them with those who don't have faith, can give some reason for their faith according to their level and their ability. And so, why is it important to demonstrate these things? Well, first, because we can. We can. Secondly, because it gives insight for us, in other words, for the faithful, it's more satisfying to see what we can see about God. And then third, because it enables us to give arguments to those who don't have faith, but have reason. And that's all humanity. Otherwise, if we didn't make use of arguments of reason, how could we speak with a non-believer? You couldn't, right? You could only speak with somebody else who accepts revelation. And so giving arguments of reason enables us to enter into dialogue with every human being. But of course, it's difficult. And then a fourth reason for it is simply because knowing these things, seeing these reasons, is in fact a kind of wisdom. Last time we said there are 3 kinds of wisdom. There's a natural wisdom, that's philosophy rightly functioning. There's a supernatural wisdom, which is what we're speaking about in these talks, theology. And then there's that wisdom of the Holy, that's the gift of the Holy Spirit. Well, proving these things with reason is natural wisdom. And so it's something worthy of man, even though it's difficult. Right? So that's why it's worth the effort. And it's something that ought to be a patrimony for everyone, and not just for the specialist, the philosopher. And Revelation itself says that these things are knowable. So just a few days ago, we had in the first reading in the daily Mass, Romans chapter 1, verse 20, that speaks about we can know God's attributes are seen through the things that He has made, through creation. And St. Paul there is developing something that already was in the Old Testament in the book of Wisdom, chapter 13, which I've given you here on page 5, which says, it's a magnificent text, all men were by nature foolish. Right? That's the word the Bible uses to speak of the atheist. The atheist is foolish, and he has, in some sense, no excuse. Why? Because from the good things seen, he did not succeed in knowing He who is. From the good things seen, in other words, from the beauty of God's creation, he didn't get to the author of them. From studying the works, he did not discern the artisan. But either fire or wind or air or the circuit of stars, the mighty water, or the luminaries of heaven, they considered gods. Right? So polytheism. Now if out of joy in their beauty they thought them gods, let them know how far more excellent is the Lord than these. For the original source of beauty fashioned them. In other words, the author, order requires a cause. Order requires an orderer. Right? Whenever we see order, we immediately, spontaneously think, well, what put that in order? What's the source of that order? So seeing the order of the cosmos, the order of nature, ought to make us perceive, not with our senses, but with our mind's eye, that there must be an orderer, and that the orderer must be more beautiful, infinitely, immeasurably more beautiful than the things that were made in that order. Right, so basically, that's the natural, that's the intuition of the mind, to see that where there's order, there's got to be a source of that order that is more beautiful. And so the Book of Wisdom ends this section by saying, for from the greatness and the beauty of created things, their original author, by analogy, is seen. It's by seeing the order of nature, by analogy, we can see their author. But only by analogy. In other words, reason gets us to a certain place. It can show us he exists. He's one. But we're knowing him only by analogy, and therefore we're knowing him very imperfectly. Okay. Anyways, that's an example of Revelation itself using an argument, a philosophical argument, to show God's existence. So St. Thomas makes use of these kinds of arguments, and other theologians like Maimonides in the Jewish context, St. Bonaventure, etc., to demonstrate revealed truths whenever we can. And such arguments can be taken from any sound philosophy, but only from sound philosophy. And so we can't use a false philosophy because it won't get us to God. So Pius XII, in that encyclical I mentioned before, Humani Generis, he speaks about how important it is in theology to use human reason in this way. And he writes, it is well known how highly the Church regards human reason, for it falls to reason to demonstrate with certainty the existence of God, personal and one. Right? That's also a natural truth, that God is personal and one. To prove beyond doubt the very foundations of the Christian faith. We'll talk about this in a couple talks down the road. To express properly the law which the Creator has imprinted on the hearts of men, natural law. And finally, to attain to some notion, indeed a very imperfect notion of the mysteries. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But reason can perform these functions safely and well only when properly trained. So the theologian, in doing this, has to make use of a sound philosophy that philosophy that's the perennial patrimony of the human mind. That philosophy gradually perfected over the course of many centuries. Okay. But, of course, any philosophy is not infallible. And so philosophical arguments, when they're used by the theologian, they can always be perfected and they can err. And so we always have to use them with a sense of humility. Now, never preferring my philosophical theory to God's Word. And that happens all the time. St. Thomas has a text where he speaks of the different levels of authority that the theologian makes use of. So, for example, when the theologian uses the contribution of a philosopher, he uses that contribution as a kind of instrument that, an instrument that could be mistaken, and that revelation itself helps to correct from possible mistakes. Because if a philosophy is mistaken, it will clash with what revelation teaches. Right? So revelation itself is a safeguard on philosophy. Not every so the theologian can use the philosopher. Obviously, he can also use other theologians. So the philosopher can use Aristotle. He can use a theologian who's also a philosopher, like St. Augustine, St. Thomas. And then, finally, revelation itself. Okay. Let's go on now to look at the mysteries. What can the theologian do with regard to the mysteries? And so here there are two fundamentally different things we can do. One thing we can do is start with something that's revealed by God, and from that deduce something else. And that's called theological deduction. And here's an example. A dogma of faith that Christ is perfect man and perfect God. From that, I can deduce many other truths, because I can deduce that Christ has whatever pertains to perfect man and whatever pertains to perfect God. So, for example, from the fact that he's perfect man, I can deduce, well, he must have a human intellect, a human soul, a human will, and free will, etc. Because otherwise he wouldn't be perfect man. And the church did this in the early centuries, combating various heresies that denied the fullness of Christ's humanity. For example, there was a heresy that said Christ had only one will, the divine will. The one will heresy. And at first sight that might seem appealing. Yes, Christ has one will, the divine will. But if that were the case, then he couldn't have been true man, because it pertains to humanity to have a human will. And worse than that, he couldn't have redeemed the world, because he redeemed the world by freely, in his humanity, laying down his life for us. So that would be an example of how we can deduce from one truth that's been revealed other truths that follow from it. Or from the fact that he's perfect God, we can therefore say that Christ has every attribute that pertains to God. St. Paul argues like this in the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15. He argues, Christ rose from the dead, and Christ is the head of the mystical body. From that we can deduce that what the head does isn't meant only for the head, but also for all the members. In other words, everything that Christ does must be for all of us, because he's the head of this mystical body. So if Christ rose, we too will rise as he rose. Because he didn't do it for himself. He did it for his mystical body. And so St. Paul makes this argument in the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15, against the initial heresy in the church, a form of initial Gnosticism that thought of the resurrection as purely spiritual and not physical, the general resurrection. In other words, there were people who were denying already when St. Paul is writing to the Corinthians that there's going to be a general resurrection of the faithful at the end of the world. Because what would we want these, in a Greek context, in a Platonic context, the body is seen as the prison of the soul. And what would we want to get these prisons back at the end of time? And so there were people who didn't accept the general resurrection, even though they did accept Christ's resurrection. And so St. Paul makes this theological deduction. Well, Christ rose. Christ is head of the mystical body. Everything he does for his body. Therefore, if you say that we will not rise in the last day, that's equivalent to saying Christ didn't rise, because those two things go together. And that's a form of theological reasoning, from one truth to a consequence. All right, and so the church makes use of this kind of reasoning all the time in combating heresies and in seeing the consequences of what it is that we believe.
Is there any reasoning that would lead a person to think that God would provide atonement and redemption? That doesn't seem to include it being part of any natural religion.
So in theological, we're not reasoning to these mysteries. What we're doing is we're from the mysteries reasoning to something else. So from one truth we try to bring out its consequences. So it's not that we reason to the redemption, but rather the opposite. From the redemption, what can we reason to? So here's a good example. From the fact that, so it's a revealed truth that Christ redeemed us. And let's do the same argument that St. Paul does. But Christ is the head of the mystical body. What Christ does, he does for us. And therefore, if he's redeemed us as the head, it seems that he would give to the members of his body redemptive power also. In other words, if he's the head and he's the redeemer, we can argue to the fact that we are called to be co-redeemers. Something like that. So it's not we're not arguing to the redemption. We can't, because it's a mystery. But from the redemption, we can see some of its consequences. We're called to participate in the redemption. Something like that.
So the mysteries we just see.
Right. The mysteries we can't, because we said theology becomes a science because it receives foundations from above, from God. And those foundations are the mysteries. Right? So we can't demonstrate the mysteries or deduce them, but from them deduce other things. Okay? We're going to do something about the mysteries, but not deduce them. Now, in all of this, we have to there's a difficulty. We have to, even simply to receive the mysteries, we have to receive them using our own categories. So you can see, already when God reveals, he's doing this operation of taking terms that belong to human life and stretching them. And so another thing that theology does is it can reflect on this stretching. What do I mean by stretching? God reveals that he's the Father of a Son, Jesus Christ. In other words, God reveals that in God there's paternity and sonship. So what do we have to do? We have to take human paternity and human sonship, but stretch them so that they can be applied to God's life. And if we don't stretch them, if we just keep, in other words, if I take my human idea of paternity and my human idea of sonship, and I just apply it to the Trinity without stretching it, what's going to happen? God doesn't fit into my notion of paternity. And this was the cause of the first great heresy, the Arian heresy. So this heretic named Arius, he said, he reasoned like this. God, the Father, is the Father of a Son, the Word, Jesus Christ. And therefore, the Father, my Father is before me. Every human father is before their son. Therefore, God the Father had to be before God the Son. But if God the Father is before God the Son, then God the Son can't be eternal, because he had a beginning. He's after the Father. Well, if you're not eternal, you're not the true God. You're not the full God. You're a demigod. You're a God with a small g. Anyway, and so Arius reached like, well, therefore Christ is not God with a capital G, but only with a small g, or something like that. Right? So that would be an example of theology failing to stretch its terms, understanding them analogically, and not univocally. A univocal term is when we understand a term with the same definition in both cases. And that makes things clear. And we like univocal terms. But the problem is, God can't speak to us about himself using univocal terms. Because he's not just like us. He's not utterly unlike us so that he can't speak to us at all. But he's much more unlike us than he is like us. And that's an understatement. And so that means that one of the things that theology has to do is be aware that even when God speaks to man, and especially then when theology seeks to reason and reflect on what God has said, that we have to understand the terms that God uses analogically and stretch them and build a ladder, as it were, of different levels of meaning till we get up to God. Let's take another example of that. So, or even the same example. At the Council of Nicaea, Arius denying the full divinity of Christ. And so what the council did was took a philosophical term and stretch it to apply it to the divinity, to the Trinity. And that was one in nature, homoousios. And defining that Christ is consubstantial with the Father. And so it's taking a philosophical term, consubstantial, and applying it to God and stretching it. Or perhaps even better, in the same controversies about the Trinity and Christ in the 4th and 5th centuries, the church had to grasp the fact that in the Trinity there are three whats. So we need a word to speak of the three distincts. And today we do it with ease, three persons. But that using that very term persons and applying it to God wasn't something that just came about effortlessly. Because one had to build an analogy and have an understanding of person that was stretched enough, that was analogical enough that it could be applied to the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, as well as to each one of us. And that's arduous, no? And that's a great work that theology does. In other words, reflecting on what God has revealed, and he has to use human categories, otherwise he can't speak to us, but reflecting on the analogy of what God has revealed, so that we don't take it univocally and reduce God to some kind of creaturehood. Well, there's a lot more that can be said about that. But let's go on to another thing that, and it's closely related, it goes together. Another thing that theology does with regard to these mysteries is not to prove them. Right? So never demonstration. Right, so we're not demonstrating, but what are we doing? Another thing that theology can do is ask, all right, God has revealed that he's a Trinity. He's revealed that he's become incarnate. We said that one of the fundamental questions that we ask in any field is, why is that? So here too, why not ask, why did God become incarnate? And he's actually told us in many different reasons. There's lots of reasons, not just one. And why is there a redemption? Why does he give grace? Why did he found a church? Why did he institute sacraments? And why 7 sacraments? And why these sacraments and not other sacraments? So we're not trying to demonstrate that God has done these things. We're starting with the fact that he has done these things, which I believe in faith. But I'm wanting to probe, why did you do that, Lord? And we ought to all be doing this in prayer, actually. Show me why you've done this, so that I can appreciate it more. But why is that important? Because if I come to see the reasons why he's become man for me, I find out what are those reasons. Well, it's because he loves me. And it's because I'm in need of this, etc., etc. And so the reasons that we uncover lead us to love him more. Right? And so asking these questions enables us to marvel over what God has done. Whereas if I don't ask the question, it's because I'm not marveling at what God has done. And I think we need to reawaken that marvel. No, and that I don't think there can be a new evangelization without the agents of that evangelization being the first who marvel about these truths. And so this question, why are you a Trinity? All right, that maybe sounds silly, but it's anything but silly. What we're seeking there is, why is it fitting? Why is it awesome? Why is it beautiful that you're a Trinity and not a a solitary? Right? Why is it more beautiful that you're a Trinity than a solitary? And why is that important for human life? That God is a Trinity and not a solitary. And so we're seeing, why is it fitting? Right? That fitting is the same as, why is it marvelous? Why is it more beautiful? Why is it wiser? If we're talking about something God has done, so down here, the incarnation, the redemption, the grace, why is it wiser that you've done this rather than something else? Right? So we're asking God that question. And so we're not, in asking this question, you can't ask it if you don't already believe. So it's a question for believers, not for unbelievers. Right? It's the believer first believes it because of the authority. And now what we're doing is trying to get under the mystery. So why such a mystery makes sense, not just human sense, because they don't make human sense, but why do they make superhuman sense? That's the question. Why do they make divine sense? Right? That's what we're asking. Right? So we're not trying to prove, yes, God has to become incarnate. And I'm going to demonstrate it. No. But given that he's become incarnate, why is that the most perfect thing for God to do? Why is it fitting that he instituted church, the sacraments, etc.? Okay. So principally, this question is for those who are within, for the faithful. But it also can be helpful for those who are inquiring. Because when a person inquires, one of the things he's looking for is, does it make sense? In other words, is there a harmony? Because probably most people are presupposing that it doesn't make any sense, that it's rather absurd. And to show to a person like that, know that there's this organic harmony, that there's a profound sense for understanding human life and the fact that God's a Trinity, that he's become incarnate, that can be very helpful to the inquirer. In fact, far more helpful, I think, than we can appreciate. Because I think a lot of times, it was this way at the beginning of our conversion, we kind of had a default idea that Christianity doesn't make sense, and that reasonable people don't believe that, and that there isn't any reason in it. Now that sounds so terrible to say all that, but the fact is that many of us get terrible prejudices. And these kinds of arguments are the things that dispel those prejudices. And perhaps the only things that dispel those prejudices. No, because a person who has that kind of prejudice isn't going to be helped by saying somebody giving an argument of authority. Right? You're going to be helped by somebody who can show why is that shed incredible light on all of human existence. So St. Thomas speaks about this in his Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 1, Chapter 9. He says, we only believe things which are above human reason because God has revealed them. In other words, we have to be careful. I don't believe in the Trinity because I have a great argument of fittingness for it. No, that's not the reason I believe. I believe because God has revealed it. But, nevertheless, there are certain persuasive arguments that should be brought forth in order to make the divine truth known. And this should be done for the training and consolation of the faithful, but not with an idea of refuting those who are adversaries. In other words, I can't refute someone who doesn't believe in the Trinity by an argument of fittingness. I can just hopefully maybe lead them to reconsider, but not refute. Otherwise, if somebody thought I was trying to prove that God is a Trinity with an argument of fittingness, they would go away even more mocking the Christian faith than they did already. Because our arguments of fittingness are too weak to prove any of these things. But they're useful. Let's just give an example. Let's take the sacraments. Why is it fitting that God established sacraments? And because at first sight you might think that that's really kind of crazy. Because baptism, that He gives supernatural life to us, how? By having some water poured on our head. And say a sentence. That seems like the cause and effect are disproportionate. He gives me supernatural life, His life, and gives me, in effect, the beginning of eternal life, if I don't stop it by mortal sin. And He does that by water and a few words. And all the sacraments are like that, with some meager elements, some bread and wine and some words. He makes the sacrifice of Calvary present on the altar. Why would God make such a magnificent effect with such poor means? And why would He make a spiritual, supernatural effect with visible, common elements? Well, so the theologian can help there if somebody poses that kind of question. And say, well, it's fitting, it's fitting for human nature. Why? Because human nature is composed of spirit and body. And so it's fitting that the means of our salvation be adapted to our nature. A spiritual effect through a bodily matter and form in the sacraments, and fitting to our human nature, and also fitting to the fact that we come to higher things through things that are on our level. And so God leads us to higher things using things that are on our level. So that would be a kind of argument of fittingness for why God established a sacramental economy of grace, a sacramental means of giving us grace through sensible things, and not just directly spiritually. And why is this important? Because this comes up all the time. For example, so many times people, Protestants, say, I just go in my corner and I confess to God and He forgives me. In other words, non-sacramentally, purely spiritually, with no sensible means. And that actually wouldn't be fitting for human nature, to give us grace in a purely spiritual way. That would be fitting for angels, but not for...
It doesn't work either. You can remain controlled by your sinful nature, and that's why Protestants think they're always depraved.
And then let's do another question here. Why 7 of them? And so somebody could answer, well, the church has defined that there are 7. But the problem is that doesn't help me to understand why these 7 and why has God done what He's done. And so St. Thomas answers, not just with authority here, see the Council, etc., of Lyon, but he says, well, we need something analogous in our spiritual life as we have in our natural life. So we could understand why there are 7 sacraments from looking at what are the 7 most important things in our natural life. And what's the first thing? Well, birth. So if in our natural life we need to start with birth, what do we need to start with in our spiritual life? Supernatural birth, baptism. And then what do we need? We need to grow to maturity in our natural life. And so it's fitting that in our supernatural life there be a sacrament of maturity, confirmation. And in order to grow every day of our lives, we need nourishment. And so it's fitting that in our supernatural life there be supernatural nourishment, the Eucharist. And in our natural life we get sick and we need healing. And so it's fitting that in our supernatural life there be a supernatural means of healing, penance and confession. And then in our natural life we have to face death and prepare for it. And so it's fitting that in our supernatural life there be a sacrament that strengthens us for that encounter and sanctifies the final and serious illness. And then man is also a social creature. And so man, in his natural life, he needs reproduction and governance. And so it seems fitting that in our supernatural life, we need that those 2 things elevated to the supernatural level. And so marriage elevated to a sacrament and a supernatural governance or headship in the church, which is holy orders. And so in that way we can make an analogy between what we need in the natural life and what God has given us in our supernatural life. And that is better than simply having an argument, well, there are 7 sacraments because this council defined it. Even though you've got to start there. That's the starting point. This council defines that there are 7 sacraments. And now we're going to question why these 7. What can we say about this Trinity? Let's just say one. We're going to hopefully have a talk on it in the future. But the fact that God is a Trinity is the most fitting thing of all. Because if there weren't a distinction of persons in God, if he's just a solitary, there's a huge problem. Because in our human experience, in human life, the highest, most beautiful thing is interpersonal communion and self-gift. The complete self-gift to another person who can receive that gift and return it. Right? That in every human, John Paul II spoke about this day in, day out. His first encyclical, Redemptor Hominis, I think it's number 10, he says, man can't live without love. Without love, his life makes no sense. Without a full gift of himself to other human beings, he is miserable. Now, if that's true in human life, and God is in other words, if we take what's most perfect in our human experience and elevate them up to God and give it a capital letter, so if there's beauty here below, God is beauty with a capital B. Well, if there's communion here below, and that's such a beautiful and perfect thing, well, how fitting it is that God is communion with a capital C, a communion of persons. That in God there's self-giving. But that there couldn't be self-giving in God if there weren't some kind of distinction of persons that make possible an infinite self-gift. And in fact, the Holy Spirit, that's one of his names, the gift. He's the gift of Father to Son and Son to Father. And so it's fitting that the Holy Spirit be given to us. But that's another argument of fittingness. And we could go on and on. Now, this doesn't prove that God's a Trinity. We're starting with the fact that God has revealed that He's a Trinity. But given that, it makes so much sense of human life that we're made in the image of a triune God and not a solitary. And that what kind of image of the family and society would come from these two notions? God made in the image of a solitary, a monarch, a single, and God made in the image of communion. God made in the image of a perfect communion of persons. Man made in the image. And it shows us that human life, John Paul II, again, is the master of this. He went back to this again and again. And so he reads that's his theology of the body, is all about this. And so taking Genesis 1:26, man made in God's image, male and female, he created them in his image. And so John Paul II connected the male and female, he created them with in his image and likeness were created. In other words, we're created for communion because we're made in the image of the triune God. Anyway, so that's an argument of fittingness that reveals something about God and reveals something about man. Okay. So by doing this, what do? What's the arguments of fittingness serve to connect these mysteries with elements of human life, and also to connect them with each other. Because each one is so intimately related to all the others that if we were to take out any one, all the others would fall, etc. And so we can make an argument of fittingness also showing how one so beautifully goes together with the other. So the First Vatican Council kind of summarizes this. It says, if reason illuminated by faith, this is on the bottom of page 9, if reason illuminated by faith inquires in an earnest, pious, and sober manner, it attains by God's grace a certain understanding of the mysteries, which is most fruitful, both from the analogy with the objects of its natural knowledge, say, the family and the mysteries, the human person and the mysteries, and from the connection of these mysteries with one another and with our ultimate end, to share in God's own beatitude. But it never becomes capable of understanding them in the way it does the truths that constitute its proper object. We'll never understand the Trinity in the same way that we understand that God exists and that He's one. Because this is something that reason can grasp directly. For divine mysteries, by their very nature, so excel the created intellect that even when they've been communicated in revelation and received by faith, they remain covered by the veil of faith itself and shrouded, as it were, in darkness, as long as in this mortal life we are away from the Lord. For we walk by faith, not by sight. So the fittingness is never going to enable us to see these, but nevertheless, it's going to give us more desire to see them. Right? That's the whole point, is that by marveling over what God has revealed, it quickens in us the desire to see them unveiled when we see God face to face. Okay. On that note, let's take our break here and then have questions.